Good morning. I'm Jonathan Harris, the Associate Pastor here at First United Methodist Church in Myrtle Beach. Today's sermon reminds us that we will face uncertain times, but through it all, God is with us, and we are God's children. Thanks for joining us. Please remain standing for the reading of the Gospel, which comes today from Matthew chapter 17. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah, talking with him. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them. And from the cloud a voice said, "This is my Son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." And the disciples asked him, "Why then do the scribes say that Elijah must come first?" He replied, "Elijah is indeed coming and will restore all things. But I tell you that Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but they did to him whatever they pleased. So also the Son of Man is about to suffer at their hands." Then the disciples understood that he was speaking to them about John the Baptist. Friends, this is the word of God for all of us, the people of God. Thanks be to God. Please be seated.
My strength, my song.
almost 10 years ago, when I'm pretty sure one of the volunteers at the hospital thinks I was 6 years old, but as I was actually preparing to graduate from college, people began asking me a question that I probably should have given much more thought to much sooner. It's the very same question that likely scares the living daylights out of anyone who's about to graduate from high school or college, especially when one's area of training is music. That question, of course, was, so what do you plan to do after graduation? Good question. Well, it was a scary question, and so I began feverishly exploring all kinds of options for what I could possibly do that would actually pay the bills. And so after much prayer and discernment, I decided that I would pursue the Peace Corps, probably hoping that aside from helping a bunch of other people, that decision would also buy me 2 more years to figure out what on earth I wanted to do with my life. I didn't realize that at the time. That's just looking back. That's probably what I was thinking. And so I quickly learned that it would be about a 1.5-year process from the time I applied to the time that I would be sent off for service. And so I applied, and I was indeed accepted. I interviewed at the regional office in Atlanta, Georgia, and I was approved to serve in Ghana, West Africa, beginning in June 2009. And it was really exciting. I dreamed of all of the things that the then 23-year-old music major would do, educating people about health and sanitation in Ghana, West Africa, 2 subjects that I happen to have absolutely no expertise in. But I began knocking out all the things that were on my to-do list that the Peace Corps gave me. I got all kinds of vaccinations, some of them for diseases that I had never heard of before and that sounded as though they had been named by Dr. Seuss. For months, I studied flashcards, learning a language called Twi, which happens to be the most widely spoken language in Ghana, and learned phrases like Mepawo Chow and Chini Pi Ngumu, which, for anybody who is not fluent in Twi, means please do not add a lot of salt. But as naive and ignorant as I probably was, I was also working really hard and doing all that I knew how to get ready, and preparation seemed to be going really well. And then one morning, I went out for a run, as I often do, and as I often did back then, and as I ran, I began itching. And the farther I got out from home, my fingers started swelling. I was literally having an allergic reaction to exercise. So as Norman shared with me after the first service, if any of you are a little swollen, it's probably because you're allergic to exercise. Thank you. But I eventually made it back home, and although I did not entirely lose consciousness, for what was probably just a few minutes or even possibly just seconds, but what seemed like hours, I temporarily went blind. Everything went black. I could not see a thing. And I sat there scared and frightened on the bathroom floor in the dark. And after those very frightening moments, my vision slowly started returning, and a housemate of mine took me to the doctor where they pumped me full of steroids and sent me home. But one of the things that I was required to do, being in this process of being sent out by the Peace Corps, was that for any kind of trip to the doctor, I had to notify them, and so I did. And so just 4 weeks before I was set out to fly to Ghana, West Africa, to begin 2 years of service, and after investing and a half of my life with no backup plan in place, I was suddenly told that my service would no longer be needed due to medical concerns. And so those ensuing days and months were filled with uncertainty. Because I had not planned to need housing arrangements in the United States while I was in Ghana, guess what I did not have in the United States? Housing. And so I was not sure where I would live. I was not sure where I would work because all of my former employers knew that I was leaving, and so they'd hired replacements to do the work I had been doing. I didn't even have a clue what I would do. It was a very uncertain time. And what that experience reminds me as I look back on it is that there are three types of people in this world. There are those of us who have been through uncertain times. There are those of us who are going through uncertain times. And there are those of us who will go through uncertain times. Having times of uncertainty is simply part of what it means to be human. Now, I know that I am not the only person who has experienced uncertain times in my life. And in fact, I know that many of you here and many outside of these walls have dealt with uncertain times that were much more difficult than those few months that I dealt with a few years back. The church where I grew up and then later the campus ministry I was part of in college participated in an annual event called the Crop Walk. And if you're not familiar with that, what it means is that we and other churches and organizations in our local community gathered once a year and we walked to raise money and to raise awareness about hunger issues in our community and around the world. And I remember every year, if you participated in that, there was a T-shirt you would get. And I remember one year in particular, the T-shirt had the face of a real child and a very short quote. The quote was this: "It wasn't my turn." Those were the words that the child had said to his teacher at school when the teacher asked him why he had not eaten breakfast that morning at home. You see, there were too many mouths to feed and not enough food to go around, and so that family literally took turns every day, and you knew that on this day it was my turn to eat breakfast, on this day it wasn't. And on that particular day, it wasn't his turn to eat. That child's life was filled with uncertainty, was it not? Just recently, a relatively new friend of mine shared with joy how he had recently gotten married last year and how that was a very exciting time. And then in the very next sentence, he shared how his wife had gone back to their home country to finish school. And while finishing school would normally be something to be excited about and to celebrate, that decision has actually clouded their lives with uncertainty. You see, he's unsure when or even if he will get to see his wife again because he and she are Muslims. Uncertainty is no foreigner to their lives. Just right here within this walls, I know that many of you have been through things, been through uncertain times that are incredibly challenging and incredibly difficult, far beyond anything that I have ever experienced. Many of you are going through a period of uncertainty now as you await test results or as loved ones await test results. Some of you feel uncertainty due to diagnoses or circumstances that have changed in ways that you never dreamed they would. There are people who have lost jobs or who have struggled for a long time to find the kind of employment that you need to make ends meet. Some of you have lost loved ones. Some of you spend a great deal of time caring for loved ones who have significant needs, even as you continue to have all the same other responsibilities and things you have to take care of that everybody else has to, just to survive. You know what it's like to deal with uncertainty, don't you? Don't you? Well, during uncertain times, it's important for us to remember that Jesus faced uncertainty in his life as well. And I'm going to repeat that because I think that's something we often neglect. Uncertainty was part of Jesus' life. I know it may sound heretical to some of you to hear someone suggest that Jesus didn't always know that in advance that everything would just turn out perfectly in the end. But we remember that while Jesus was fully God, he was also fully human, and part of what it means to be fully human is to face uncertainty. And so in our gospel story, we've reached the point in Jesus' life where Jesus knows that some uncertain and potentially very dark days are ahead of them. It's a pivot point in Matthew's gospel, and everything after this point leads towards the cross and the crucifixion. It's a story that we will recount together in the coming weeks as we journey together through the season of Lent. And we remember that just as we don't typically know how the trials and the troubles of our lives will turn out, Jesus did not have absolute certainty that light would follow the dark days ahead or that resurrection would follow death. It had never happened before. If he'd known that everything would turn out all right, then why would he have been deeply grieved and prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane for the things that he was going to face to go away? Why would he have cried out from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Jesus knew uncertainty. And so at the pivot point in Jesus' life and in Matthew's gospel, where Jesus begins moving closer and closer to that very dark and uncertain future, we get a story that seems a little strange and perhaps even a little bit comical to our modern ears. Jesus goes up on a mountain with a few of his best buddies, and while they are there, they see two old guys who have been dead for centuries and hear the voice of God. I've always wondered why on earth Jesus would say on the way down the mountain for his disciples not to tell anybody about that story until later on. And it hit me that the answer to that question might actually be simple. Who on earth would believe a story that crazy? But of course, that's not just some crazy story. There's much more to it than that. As Jesus and his disciples awaited a future that was so uncertain and ominous, the events that were to unfold in the coming days were put into perspective against a historical backdrop that was much bigger than just them. The path that Jesus and his followers were about to walk was part of a much larger path that had already been walked by that stuttering man named Moses, whom God had called more than 1,000 years earlier to rescue God's chosen people from slavery in Egypt. The journey they were about to take was one that had already begun and had been walked by the prophet Elijah, whose name and whose words and whose life had proclaimed to everyone around, "Yahweh is my God." No matter what unfolded in Jesus' uncertain future, he would be accompanied by those who had gone before him. The writer of Hebrews wrote, "Since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us." Like Jesus, no matter what unfolds in our own uncertain futures, we are accompanied by those who have gone before us. And while the great cloud of witnesses that surrounds us and goes with us does not erase our troubles and uncertainties, it does put those uncertainties into perspective. It does change things, does it not? Anybody ever tried to go through something incredibly difficult all by yourself? How'd it turn out? How many of you have been through something incredibly difficult and had people by your side helping you along, even if they couldn't really do a whole lot to change your circumstances? It changes things, does it not? But we not only have these people, this cloud of witnesses, these members of a larger story who go with us to support us. The fact that we simply share a path that is larger than us, that is much bigger than we are, also gives us much needed perspective as we encounter our troubles. Maybe you've been through something difficult before, and as you were going through it, it felt like the most difficult, the most significant thing that had ever happened in the history of humankind. And yet, if you had a chance afterwards to take a step back and zoom out and see the big picture, or at least part of the big picture, you see that there are many more events that have been significant in the history of humanity, right? It reminds me of an illustration that Michael Gungor shares in his book, The Crowd, the Critic, and the Muse. He shares how most scientists believe that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. I know at 8:30 we didn't have anybody who had been here that long, but I don't... All right. But they estimate that humans have been on earth for approximately 200,000 years. And 200,000 years sounds like a long time. But I want you to do something with me, a little bit of an exercise. Just, if you can do this without hitting your neighbor in the face, just spread your arms out. And if you pretend like from fingertip to fingertip is the whole 4.5 billion years of the earth, then how much of your arm or your hand do you think you have to would represent all of human history? A hand? A finger? A fingernail? Try taking a nail file and taking one swipe to your fingernail, and you would have just wiped out all of human history. We are part of a story that is incomprehensibly larger than we are. We're part of a story that is so much bigger. The story involves billions upon billions upon billions of characters we have never met and who we don't even know existed. And while that doesn't minimize the fears and the uncertainties and the struggles and the pains of our lives, it does put them in perspective, does it not? We are part of something much bigger, which gives us the courage to move forward in hope. We have the cloud of witnesses who are part of our story. We have the perspective of knowing we're part of a bigger story, but that's not the only encouragement we receive. Jesus did not merely get a powerful reminder that he wouldn't go through uncertain times that faced him alone. He didn't just gain perspective of those uncertain times being part of a much larger story. He also received confirmation that no matter what unfolded in the days ahead, he was God's child. And nothing that could transpire could ever change that. Most, if not all of you, have probably heard me talk before about the Haywood Street congregation in Asheville, North Carolina by now. It's a United Methodist Church, and it's unique in that the majority of its congregation is homeless, is people who do not have homes. And many of those people have been told that they're worthless. They've been told that they have absolutely nothing to offer to the world. Rather than being known by their actual names, they're instead known by the names that other people impose on them, like the homeless, the poor, the less fortunate, the least of these, the lost, so on and so forth. They don't always know where their next meal will come from or where they'll sleep that night, and I have to be honest, I cannot imagine a way of life that could be filled with more uncertainty than that. And so being aware of the uncertainty in their lives and knowing how they've been taught over and over again how worthless they are, I'm fascinated by a ritual that they use each week to conclude their time of worship together at that church. A member of that group will stand up and face the congregation, kind of like I'm doing now. But rather than offering a benediction, that person will instead ask them a question. Whose child are you? To which the congregation responds, God's child. And then it kind of turns almost into a back and forth. Whose child are you? God's child. Whose child are you? God's child. And it's amazing to see how people who the rest of the world treats as utterly worthless find purpose and meaning in their identity as children of God. In that space, they lead worship, they lead prayer, they read scripture, offer testimonies, serve food, and extend love to one another and to the strangers in their midst. Overwhelmed by God's abundant love poured out freely in their lives, they cannot help but respond in faith. Now, that doesn't mean that they're going to know where their next meal is coming from or where they're going to sleep that night. But they know who they are and whose they are. And that makes a difference. Just as those church members who participate in that wonderful ritual might not know where dinner will come from or where they will sleep at night, knowing that you are a child of God does not ensure that you will be spared from trouble or uncertainty or pain in your life. Jesus would go on to be scorned, spit on, beaten, and killed after all. Being a child of God does not mean that we will not have pain and uncertainty in our lives. But what it does mean is that no matter what those uncertain and dark days that we face hold, those things do not define who you and I are. If you face uncertainty on religious grounds, then take heart, because so did Jesus. If you face uncertainty because of where you're from, then take heart, because so did Jesus. If you face uncertainty because of situations and circumstances that seem far from anything you would have possibly chosen for yourself, then take heart, because so did Jesus. And take heart that no matter what darkness or uncertainty you face, you are a child of God, loved by God, because God made you. That's just who God is. My dear friends, uncertainty will come, will it not? Uncertainty will come, will it not? Darkness will come, will it not? But if you can find no other comfort or source of hope in those times of uncertainty and darkness, just remember, you are not alone. You walk a path that has been traveled by billions before you, surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, and you are accompanied by the one who calls you a child of God. So listen to him. Thanks be to God. Amen. Thank you again so much for joining us this morning. If you'd like more information about our services, please visit our website, which is FUMCMB.org, or call our church office at 843-448-7164. Thank you.